Greetings, dear readers. Now, before I begin this next Halloween 2022 review, I have just one question for all of my fellow readers here. Do you remember, or did you ever experience, a Goosebumps phase when you were a child? For that shall be the subject of today's review, my fellow readers. Today, for Halloween 2022, we shall dive into the old history of our childhoods. However many of us grew up with this classic children's horror series. Let's get started, shall we? Ah, the days of Goosebumps. I feel like everyone has had a taste of this classic literary series at least once throughout their childhoods, whether it was through the classic tales, the Series 2000, or Goosebumps Horrorland. Or you may have simply experienced it through the old TV show that they did way back then on Cartoon Network. To be honest, Goosebumps itself was a major part of my childhood. And quite honestly, I grew up mostly with the classic series. Now I did have a few tastes of Series 2000 or Goosebumps Horrorland, but they never really stuck with me quite as much as the classic series. In fact, a funny story, when I was young, I actually received a whole box full of the classic Goosebumps stories. I have no idea what I did with them. Did I grow them? Did I just get rid of them? I'm not entirely sure. But all in all, the one thing I do remember was back then in elementary school, whenever we did have those nice little book fairs, I would always be so enraptured by the next Goosebumps title on the shelves. And to be honest with you guys, this one was definitely one of my go-to horror series way back in the day. Now I am progressively getting my way back into horror itself, after a long time of avoiding it due to the whole demonic tales and everything else. But I figured there's a difference between horror movies and horror literature. And to be quite honest with you guys, I will never forget my days of Goosebumps. To be honest, it's one of the few series I look back on from my childhood with a great fondness. Despite the fact that it was horrifying, it's genuinely harmless when you think about it. One of the things that I definitely enjoyed, though, was R.L. Stine's writing. He always managed to enrapture you within just 100 or so pages. Literally, you were hooked throughout start to finish. And to be honest with you guys, one of the things I definitely liked was how R.L. Stine always kept you guessing. In the end, he always pulled these massive cliffhangers at the end, this nice little twist that really just keeps you hooked for more. You keep questioning and wondering what's going to happen next. And honestly, that was one of the biggest draws in for the series. Every single book always left me guessing about what would happen next. Something you would probably never know now. You would think the book was about to end, and then in the final page or so, you have that sudden twist. Some of these were harmless, some of these were genuinely terrifying. But, to continue, I would like to cover some of my most possibly absolute favorite titles from the classic series, as it is definitely the one that I remember the most with the greatest amount of fondness. So, let's begin. So the first of my favorites, I say, would be, of course, Night of the Living Dummy, numbers 1, 2, and 3. Now, if you were to ask me which one would be the best of the Night of the Living Dummy books, I would say it's a fair tie between numbers 1 and 2. Because the reason being, number 1 introduced a different dummy besides Slappy, who was the possessed wooden puppet, which that definitely brought in a nice little change, especially considering the original puppet, Mr. Wood, in my opinion, was far more nasty than Slappy. Slappy definitely has its moments, but he feels more like a regular old villain. Mr. Wood felt like he was essentially more or less a bit more violent prone. He definitely has moments where he was more slappier than Slappy. And definitely the biggest thing that I can remember from the first book was of course him spraying this foul-smelling liquid all across the audience. But Night of the Living Dummy 2 is definitely one of the best and one of the most memorable in my opinion, due to the fact that this one is Slappy-centric, but it really shows Slappy, in my opinion, at his absolute worst. He not only crushes the little girl's hand, but he also turns Amy's family against her, and essentially he goes on to essentially slam open the closet, talk her down, and the way he ends is pretty violently, as a matter of fact. His head literally breaks open, signifying his death. And in my opinion, this is why I say Night of the Living Dummies number 1 and 2 definitely stand out compared to Night of the Living Dummy 3, which, while good, just kind of felt more of the same, in my personal opinion. But let's move on to the next ones. Next we have Stay Out of the Basement, Phantom of the Auditorium, and Attack of the Mutant. Stay Out of the Basement definitely has a very frightening concept when you think about it, especially considering it involves living plant people. A scientist's experiments go wrong, creating a living clone of his out of living plant material. You have Phantom of the Auditorium, which genuinely has a nice ending, but at the same time it still leaves you with that shock value at the end. And in my opinion, Phantom of the Auditorium, while definitely one of the more tame of R.L. Stine's books, is definitely one of the most memorable, and in fact it is one of my biggest personal favorites among the Goosebumps storylines, just because it was the first episode of the series I ever watched, and I think it was actually one of the first books I ever read of Goosebumps. Now, as for Attack of the Mutant, the reason why I like it is because it presents the story of superheroes and supervillains being brought in. But it also feels like a bit of a satire for supervillain and superhero comic books, especially considering our main villain, the masked mutant, literally lives in the real world, and creates a very interesting cliffhanger, with having Skipper, the main character of this book, turning himself into a comic book character by walking into the masked mutant's home base, which was definitely a very interesting twist. A lot better than the show did, at the very least. Stay Out of the Basement definitely had the most creepiest one, as well as the one that kept you guessing the most. With Margaret's father, the famous scientist, at first it looks like everything's going to end very wholesomely, with the dad defeating the plant clone copy, and then everything becomes hunky-dory, only to have a flower nudging Margaret, proclaiming that he is her real father. And to be quite honest, that was definitely a very unsettling moment, not going to lie. But let's move on to the last personal picks of the Goosebumps series. And finally, in the spirit of Halloween, we have The Haunted Mask 1 and 2, and of course, Attack of the Jack-O-Lanterns. To me, The Haunted Mask is definitely one of my all-time favorites, simply because of the fact that it takes the concepts of Halloween, and even Halloween masks, making them stand out as real faces, taking over people, and in my opinion, The Haunted Mask definitely stands out even amongst the TV show. Both stories of The Haunted Mask and Haunted Mask 2, I love how this brought the whole connected universe into it, especially considering how later on this was more confirmed with the whole Goosebumps Horrorland series. But those little hints like Monster Bloods 1, 2, and 3, Night of the Living Dummy, The Haunted Mask, it all hints that this is all occurring in the same universe. That Goosebumps itself is all in this one massive universe. It's a fascinating concept. But The Haunted Mask definitely stands out to me as one of the creepiest ones. I mean, can you imagine having your own personality, as well as your own identity, being stolen from you by a mask that was originally made of human skin, and was shown to be a real face at one point that was morphed and turned ugly and monstrous? Even more so with The Haunted Mask 2, where we have one of Carly Beth's best friends being essentially turned into an old man. He walks slow. He essentially starts craving porridge, he actually has these moments where he starts acting like an old man. It's fascinating to see these masks essentially taking over their wearers, like possessing them in a way. Attack of the Jack-o'-lanterns was more or less you trick or treat forever, which was definitely a very haunting idea, and especially the most exhausting. And it definitely puts a dark spin on Halloween itself. But Attack of the Jack-o'-lanterns, in my opinion, was definitely another good one, but it really pales to the haunted mask stories. But I have a question for you, my fellow readers and watchers. What was your favorite book of the Goosebumps series? Whether it was classic, Horrorland, or even the Series 2000. I want to know. I want to hear your all's opinions in the comments of which one stood out the most to you, which one, even now as an adult. The Goosebumps series, which one of them stood out to you the most? Which one was your absolute favorite? Tell me down in the comments. I'd like to know. And more importantly, you all, thank you once again for listening to this crazy man's ramblings, especially for this time on Halloween. More importantly, if you wish to stay tuned for more spooky content, feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe for more. And if you're interested in even more of the reviews that I do, well then, stay tuned.